First Class, Fox seemed to think that for an X-Men film to be popular, it had to center on Wolverine. It's bewildering then that once they were ready to give him his own prequel, the studio would also assume the opposite, that a film in which Wolverine is the title character must have X-Men in it to also be successful. Apparently, despite having a very specific goal, tell the origin of Wolverine, the same formula had to apply to this movie. Wolverine is the focal point, but he's got to be surrounded by a bunch of underdeveloped supporting characters with superpowers. It's clear that this movie was made not to tell an interesting story, but because it was good business. Fox has to make an X-Men film every couple of years or so the rights to the characters won't revert back to Marvel. And despite the fact that one movie already pretty much told us all the interesting stuff about Weapon X, the studio thinks the general audience needs a watered-down movie like this to spell out exactly who Wolverine is and why he lost his memory before an actual Wolverine movie can be made that doesn't have the X-Men title weighing him down. I'm not saying Wolverine is more interesting than any of the other X-Men necessarily. I'm saying that he's got interesting source material all his own, and that if you tell the right Wolverine story, you don't need to pad it with whatever popular mutants haven't made it into a movie yet. Chances are nobody's favorite characters will get enough screen time or be significant enough to the story to satisfy their fans, and what's added to the background won't be intriguing enough to warrant revisiting this material. And, in my humble opinion, that's exactly what happened. And may I add, the producers mentioned in the making of featurette on the DVD that they wanted to tell a story about Wolverine's time in Japan after the Weapon X project. But the studio insisted the origin had to be told before they could justify greenlighting that story. I hope I don't eat my words later, but that movie is getting made now, and I'll be really surprised if it isn't several notches above this one in quality of storytelling. Historically, whenever a studio gets too involved with a property like this that has vast source material and people at the helm who seem passionate about it, the project becomes half-hearted. X-Men Origins Wolverine has often been described as a train wreck. An Amazon.com user who reviewed the film retitled it Wolvie and Pals 4: How This Mess Began. Most of its problems lie in its inception. It's simply a classic example of starting a story in the wrong place and then frantically trying to convince the audience that the story they're telling is worth being told. The title instantly gives away the first wrong move, made before even the script writing process began. It's an X-Men movie first and a Wolverine movie second. It's the secondary character's movie as much as it is Wolverine's, and his characterization really gets lost in the shuffle. And Hugh Jackman's performance is very consistent with what he did in the previous movies, but that's part of the problem. Here's a guy who lost his memory and had to completely start over, and when we finally get a good long look at the man he was before all that happened to him, we get more of the same. He's rough and tumble, but compassionate. He's got a temper, but he also has a heart. He's a hothead, and he'll do anything to protect his friends or go after people who hurt his friends. I mean, we know all this already. Fans expected to see the beast within, the berserker rage that comes after Wolverine's been violated by the Weapon X program and turned into a killing machine. That's talked about, played up like it's the central theme with Kayla's repeated phrase, "You're not an animal," but we don't really see it. Just after Logan, naked and enraged, suffers indescribable pain, his bones covered with adamantium, which he's forced to feel because anesthesia doesn't work on him, and he jumps down a huge waterfall, he's having dinner with some nice folks in the country. No, this man's not an animal. At no point does he feel even the least bit uncivilized. Now, is that a problem because I'm a fanboy and I want to see my favorite stories put on screen panel for panel? No, of course not. It just makes me educated about this character before I walked into the movie, and so I get the sense that there's a lot of change for the sake of change. As I've said in other reviews, if you deviate greatly from the source material and all the stuff that makes for a good narrative is still there, I can't complain. But if the source material is a lot more engaging and the character development is really weak, I've got to question why those decisions were made. So, before I delve any further into where the movie went wrong, and delve I shall, let me get the stuff I really liked out of the way. Frustratingly, a lot of what worked in this movie felt like it should have been in a different movie, so please keep that in mind. Really, everybody's well cast. Ryan Reynolds makes a great Wade Wilson, I think, and in fact, now that I know slightly more about Deadpool, I probably should have put him in my top 50 casting choices. I like the dry way he delivers his one-liners toward the beginning of the movie, and for one, I wouldn't have minded to see a little more of him before he gets his mouth stitched up and becomes Weapon 11. While I think that whole plot line is a poor choice from a narrative point of view, I do like Stryker's foreshadowing line, "If you didn't have that mouth on you, you'd be the perfect soldier." Danny Huston makes a compelling younger William Stryker who seems to really get the character, unfortunately quite a bit more than the script seems to. He comes off as the right kind of prejudiced and bigoted, but the story doesn't let him be the cool and calculating soldier he was in X2. His plans are just too thinly veiled, but that's not Huston's fault. It still would have been nice to see Brian Cox return as he'd wanted to. He thought they could use the imaging software from X3 that was used to make Professor X and Magneto look younger, and I would have liked to have seen how that would have translated to a whole movie. I like Taylor Kitsch's Gambit. He looks great, and I love how suave he is. The idea to make him the first mutant to escape the Weapon X program actually makes some sense with X2, as his name shows up briefly as one of the mutants held at Alkali Lake. The fight scene involving him, Wolverine, and Sabretooth in the alley is my favorite in the movie. Wolverine slashing through ladder rungs is classic Wolverine action, and it looks great. And I love how Gambit moves with his stick. Gambit comes off almost as a cameo, and I'm not sure why his team up with Wolverine later on the island couldn't have lasted until the final moments of the movie. Liev Schreiber is fantastic as Sabretooth. I love his energy and the intense menace he brings. With better character motivation, he would have been brilliant. Weirdly, I think the scene Wolverine comes most alive is when he has to box with Fred Dukes, the Blob, and he just can't take him seriously now that he's gotten an eating disorder and gained so much weight. The prosthetics and costume, by the way, is fantastic on Dukes, and Kevin Durand is very funny. Wolverine can't stop making cracks about him, and I wish we saw a little more of this side of Wolverine throughout the film, especially if we're not going to get the real primal version. It's genuinely funny when he says, "Fred Dukes, that looks like the monster that ate Fred Dukes," and the whole gag about Fred mishearing Logan say bub, thinking he said blob, is kind of funny, but it would work better if Logan said bub a little more often. I know a lot of critics complained even about the quality of the action in this movie. Most everything looks pretty good to me, with the exception of the obligatory walking in front of a huge explosion like it's not their scene. Although I gotta say, I got kinda sick of watching Wolverine and Sabretooth constantly running at each other. And if this has to have X-Men in the title, it's a welcome surprise to see a young Cyclops in a cameo from Professor X, and having Wolverine's origin tied directly into the recruiting of one of the X-Men. It's also really neat when Cyclops, who can't see, is guided through the tunnels to safety by an unknown force, only to discover it's Professor X. Maybe a little convenient that he has to wear a blindfold so he won't accidentally see Wolverine for the sake of continuity, but whatever. Curiously, my two biggest complaints with this movie are the same ones I had with Elektra. The focus being taken off the title character in favor of other characters, though at least in this case not a made-up girl with typical teen angst, and interesting background being replaced with something more hackneyed and watered down. You don't have to be a fan to see through these flimsy plots, but the biggest difference between them is that Elektra's plot was just made up and dull, and Wolverine's took bits and pieces from lots of Wolverine and X-Men stories and forced them together like pieces from half a dozen different jigsaw puzzles. The opening scene is borrowed from Origin, where we discover that Wolverine was a kid in the 1800s, that Victor Creed's abusive father is also his father, and that he had claws before the Weapon X program made of bone. And already weird changes are made for seemingly no good reason. This scene takes place in 1840, while in Origin, Logan wasn't even born until 1888. As Roger Ebert pointed out in his review of the film, he's apparently in the Northwest Territories of Canada, which weren't even formed until 1870. Origin at least had the good sense to make Wolverine Canadian during a time when there was a Canada. But I don't mean to nitpick. I suspect this was just lazy writing. For whatever reason, the filmmakers seemed to think it would be fun to see Logan in the Civil War. Then the opening credits show us snapshots of Logan and Victor fighting in wars from the Civil War to both World Wars to Vietnam. Despite being Canadians, it looks like they're always fighting for America, and there's no explanation as to why they feel the need to do this. This idea, I'm sure, is taken from comic book stories about Wolverine fighting in World War II with Captain America. And then much of the rest of the film is, of course, based on stories about the Weapon X program. The movie covers too much time and starts in the wrong place. There are a lot of potential good stories here, but none of them are explored, except for Weapon X, which is made so convoluted, I found myself wishing they had just left us guessing, if there was anything we were even still curious about after the events in X2. Origin as a movie all by itself might have been a good period piece, but probably not exciting enough for a general audience. That's a story that doesn't even feel like it's about Wolverine until very late, and while it might be cool as an art house picture, it's unrealistic to think something like that would ever get made. What about a story that really explores Wolverine's time in the military, or just with the covert ops team he's with before Stryker goes too far and kills innocent civilians to get his hands on adamantium? A film like that could have really delved into the relationship between Logan and Victor, showing us why Victor is so unreserved and has such a thirst for blood. It could depict their relationship as something more complex than just the simple revenge story we get here, and it would warrant the addition of all these extra characters if we saw them as a team throughout the bulk of the film. Wolverine quitting could happen in the last act and might be all the reason Stryker needs to find a way to kidnap him and force him into the Weapon X program, which is more in line with the comics as opposed to Stryker coming up with a flimsy and obviously manipulative way to convince Wolverine to volunteer for the program, which in this movie just makes Wolverine come off as idiotic. Or, finally, the film could start with Weapon X, with Wolverine again forced into the program, breaking out of the facility, and now with these new metallic claws, an indestructible skeleton, and no memory of who he is, with a narrative that follows his journey to go from wild animal to civilized human being again. And the reason I'm spelling out all these alternatives is to make this point. Just because the producers had to do a movie about Weapon X doesn't mean there wasn't the potential for a compelling story here, and there seems to be really no rhyme nor reason to why we get such a convoluted mess. So here now are the fundamental story points that I think really don't work and why. Number 1, Logan volunteers for Weapon X. Stryker is very obviously pulling his strings. He comes to Wolverine in Canada 6 years after Wolverine left the strike team because of Stryker's unconscionable tactics to ask for his help. He says, "Your country needs you," to which Logan responds, "I'm Canadian," which, by the way, is a cool line. Then, after Victor allegedly kills Logan's girlfriend, Stryker suddenly shows up again, offering to give him the tools necessary to take Victor out. Stryker says, "I came to warn you." Except that only a couple scenes back, he said he was there to recruit Logan. Logan should have seen through this right away. It's painfully obvious he has ulterior motives for turning Logan into Weapon X, especially since he's conveniently there when bad things start happening. It's a big reveal that Victor was working for Stryker the whole time, and that he only killed all those old members of Wolverine's team so Wolverine would want revenge, and agree to the Weapon X program. And this plot is so convoluted, it's just not believable. Why would Stryker go to so much trouble just to convince Wolverine to go through with the experiment? He acts like Wolverine was nearly indestructible before Weapon X, like, because of his healing factor, there's no way he could have been caught and restrained and forced to go through with the experiment. But he was in the comics, and it would feel far less hackneyed if it were done that way here. Instead, Wolverine's getting more and more durable each movie, regardless of this being a prequel, so now he can heal from gunshot wounds to the head automatically when they used to at least put him down for a minute or two. The guy doesn't have super strength or anything, he could be contained. And wouldn't Wolverine being horrendously violated by the government be a much more interesting problem for this character to explore than just a typical revenge motive? That's what X2 was about. Stryker doesn't see mutants as people, he sees them as animals to be experimented on. It would be far more compelling to see Wolverine in that helpless position, and would make his background that much more tragic and perhaps worth seeing firsthand. Number 2, major plot points only happen because this is a prequel, and we know they have to. This is what I like to call prequelitis, where events occur because the universe deems it must be so. Wolverine almost gets his mind erased during the Weapon X experiment, but because he overhears Stryker talking about it, that's when he breaks out and it doesn't happen. So an extremely silly and unbelievable way is devised to make sure his losing his memories is the climax of the movie. Stryker purposefully shoots him in the head to make sure he loses his memories. He knows, somehow, that that'll work. And there's really no explanation given as to why he wants Wolverine to get amnesia so bad, other than thinking he can't kill him. Now, I'm going to assume it's because he doesn't want Wolverine coming after him later, though that's pretty odd given that in X2, he gives Wolverine hints about his past. Oh, and may I add, why would you wait to erase his memories until after you've given him an adamantium skeleton? Why wouldn't you start with that? At any rate, we're not watching this movie to see why he lost his memories. As I've mentioned in my other X-Men reviews, if you're paying enough attention to flashbacks in X2, you'll hear scientists saying he'll have no memory. So we know from that his memories were lost somehow during the experiment. That's really all we need to know. What we might be interested in is, I don't know, what Wolverine did when he first lost his memory. In short, Weapon X should be the beginning of this movie, not the end. It doesn't matter that this is a character who's supposed to get amnesia. Your protagonist losing his entire memory at the end of a story makes the story pretty pointless. It wouldn't matter if he went through any character arc because the status quo has just been reset for him. So a story set well before that happened, or a story set just after that, is necessary to make Wolverine someone we really care about. Plus, the stakes must be higher than Wolverine wants revenge, especially when we discover that Kayla isn't dead and that she was involved with the whole elaborate conspiracy. And they must be higher than Stryker has an adamantium bullet that will make Logan lose his memory. He's got a healing factor, but he's not invincible, and he's not very interesting if he is. Also, on a side note, the movie seems to think it's really clever for showing us where Logan got his trademark leather jacket, reminding us of his love for motorcycles. Those kinds of references are more fun when the story is competent. And finally, number 3, Wolverine is only the linchpin in a much larger plan. In some ways, this is Deadpool's story before it's Wolverine's, and we all know how satisfied Deadpool fans were with this movie. Wolverine is turned into Weapon X in order to give Deadpool his healing factor because Wade Wilson is Weapon 11. An ultimate weapon designed to be indestructible with as many mutant powers as can safely coexist in one body. So Wolverine had to get an adamantium skeleton in order for Weapon 11 to have healing factor? What? Stryker's nuts. He gives a guy who doesn't trust him an indestructible skeleton complete with metal claws, and that's not even his endgame? He's just setting himself up to have to deal with a rogue agent. This obviously wasn't thought out at all, and so now 2 big Marvel characters are given backgrounds which are far less interesting than the comic book versions. If you don't know, Deadpool really was part of the Weapon X project in the comics, and the point really was to give him healing factor, though not all those other powers. Oh, and he actually did enter the program willingly, so it's kind of ironic that what's done to him in this movie seems to be against his will. Wade was offered a chance to get rid of his cancer by doing this experiment in the comics, but instead it just made his cancer worse. So he was sent to the Weapon X reject facility, where the inmates bet on who would get experimented on and probably killed next. And Wilson was high on the list until the healing factor finally manifested and he survived. He named himself Deadpool because he beat the odds. Here, Stryker names him Deadpool because, I guess because that's his name in the comics. Now, I will say that while this, just like Wolverine, isn't very compelling character background, this isn't supposed to be Deadpool's movie, and I guess I could still kind of see the character becoming more or less the same guy with this background later. Deadpool fans were very upset that he was reduced to an endgame fighting game boss. Think about it, he's the last big opponent, and he has all the powers of everyone Wolverine's fought previously. And that his mouth was sealed shut, when Deadpool is supposed to be the merc with a mouth. I don't like irony for the sake of irony. Really, sealing up the mouth of the guy whose main shtick is that he won't stop talking is kind of Smallville bad. But still, he isn't really Deadpool yet, and it's clear that at least at this point, a spin-off was intended, especially with the stinger at the end of the credits. At the time of this review, however, the plan seems to be to abandon this version and start from scratch. I imagine the day Deadpool fans heard about that, they threw parties. As I said, if this were a different movie, there are some good ideas here. Wolverine getting caught up in a conspiracy planned by his former general, all to trap him into becoming a terrible weapon. I might have loved that if Wolverine really were the be-all end-all weapon and not Deadpool, and if it ultimately happened against his will. Seeing Wolverine with a covert ops team of mutants would be great if it were more of the movie and if it focused on Wolverine's relationships with each of them. And a cat-and-mouse game between Wolverine and Sabretooth is great, but I want to get in their heads and understand what fuels their rivalry. We've just got a really jumbled mess here. It's got its moments, but it doesn't feel like a cohesive piece, and I'd rather use my imagination to fill in the gaps of the fascinating bits of backstory we get for Wolverine and Stryker in X2, rather than find out that this hashed-out nonsense about a fake murder and an adamantium bullet is how it really went down. I'm giving X-Men Origins Wolverine a 1.5 out of 4.